I am Krista and my topic is literary media. Have you ever found yourself stuck after a situation where you've got deadlines and you've just gotten broken up with a partner or some other huge life event where you've been stressed out and you just want to escape, you just want to get out? For me, I find myself trapped in a book when that happens, and it's usually accompanied by some kind of downside in my checking account from Barnes & Noble. I tend to find that in times when I've increased stress, I want to lose myself in the pages of a book, or I want to escape from real life in some kind of fantasy world. So, per the Association of American Publishers, the U.S. book publishing industry generated $26 billion in 2020 alone. Most shockingly, this occurred during an economic downturn due to COVID-19. This shows that promising numbers in regular sales years were even higher. An industry that commands such a large amount of money demands an attention. While the publishing industry is a monumental show of the public's love for literature, it's not the only avenue for people to follow when searching for an escape. With the easing accessibility of modern technology, books and other forms of literary media can be accessed on items such as phones, Kindles, or even smartwatches if you have good enough eyesight. In summation, the role of technology in expansion to access literary media is irreplaceable. The profound importance of this role leads me to my literature review. The two most vital articles to my research in the scholarly conversation are strategies used by gifted students to cope with stress during their high school international baccalaureate program by Elizabeth Shaughnessy, and exploring coping strategies of different generations of students starting university by Rita Takas. The article by Shaughnessy focuses on the use of escapism in relation to procrastination and how it is utilized by gifted students specifically to cope with a high-stress environment. The study found that gifted youth have a heightened tendency to cope with their problems head-on rather than with procrastination and enduring their stress for longer amounts of time. While this topic is similar to my topic, it falls short as it does not cover the spectrum of generations. The article by Takasa explores the complexities and characteristics of coping strategies within 3 different age groups of students starting university. This study concluded that Generation Z is weaker in regards to handling adverse emotions compared to Generation Y. This includes differences in effectiveness of coping strategies between generations. This discussion is adjacent to my topic in many ways, such as a variable of generations, but fails to include a variable on escapism or literature. The identified gaps in variables between coping strategies within generations, in combination with the variable of escapism through reading, leads me to my research question. What is a generational tendency to cope with stress through self-conscious escapism in literary media? Before diving into my selected methodology, here are some helpful definitions for this topic. Escapism is the tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment and engaging in fantasy. Self-conscious escapism is the intentional choice to seek such relief. Literary media is the main means of mass communication through works of creative imagination, including formal writing, or in some instances, journalism or song. The tendency is an inclination towards a particular characteristic or type of behavior, and a coping mechanism is a conscious or unconscious psychological strategy that one relies on to manage or reduce stress and unpleasant emotions. My chosen methodology is an open participants virtual survey that records data on participants' age, gender, generation, and coping habits related and unrelated to escapism in literary media. I felt that this methodology best fit my research as it identifies the numerical occurrences of coping mechanisms and also the reasoning behind those behaviors. It allows for both a quantitative and qualitative examination of the topic that provides a greater depth for the data and analysis equally. My original hypothesis was that younger generations will have an increased tendency for intentional coping through virtual forms of literary media, such as audiobooks or ebooks, while older generations will have an increased tendency to unintentionally cope through stress through physical forms of literary media, such as books or newspapers. Some limitations that I faced were sample size, gender, and quantity of ages. The total participant amount was 252, with a majority of Gen Z at 49.2% and Gen X at 21.4%. A part of my struggle with this survey was getting enough participants total, majorly in the older generations. I had plenty of access to younger generations, and Generation Z specifically, but it was a struggle to get baby boomers and Generation X. The variable of gender was not one pinpointed prior to my data analysis and was initially accounted for just for purposes of organization, but the importance of the variable became distinctly evident in the majority female percentage at around 71%. While these percentages make up the foundation of the research data, it is vital to recognize the resulting limitations that the accuracy and bias of the data, limitations to the accuracy and bias of the data when considering the following evidence presented. The first set of questions within the survey gather information on the prevalence of the baseline tendency, an unintentional tendency, and an increased compulsion towards the tendency with additional stress. The data obtained from the first question establishes a baseline understanding and confirmation for the existence of significant use of coping through literary media between all generations. The question is vital to the research as it establishes the foundational claim of the initial hypothesis. The data builds such integrity as it shows a prevalence of no less than 65% over all generations. The second question tests the self-conscious aspect of the hypothesis with the unintentional occurrence. Straying from the expected result, the data shows a large tendency towards unconscious use rather than intentional. This is additionally supported by the third question, which canvasses the prevalence of an increased compulsion. The resulting data shows a decrease in percentage of affirmative answers over all generations. This decrease indicates a higher prevalence of unconscious than predicted previously, as there is not a noticeable compulsion toward media consumption with a larger portion of the sample group than met prior. While this decrease is significant, unconscious use still fails to meet a majority percentage in any single one of the generations, showing that overall self-conscious escapism through literary media still holds a higher tendency. The inclusion of the variable of physical and virtual media usage frequency was intended to discover a correlation between the passing generations and the increasing accessibility of technology over the years. The proposed correlation was found to be substantially supported by data with a greater percentage of baby boomers and a lower percentage of Gen Z utilizing physical media as well as the opposing response reciprocating the uses of virtual media in an opposite fashion. The questions reveal a staggering majority towards all of these tendencies, with the lowest percentage of all three questions at 61% in Gen Z on the third question. Additional data, this was done as in my survey, I initially cut out a portion of the data because I thought it was irrelevant, but looking back on the study, I found that it was more important to add this in to stabilize my final conclusion. The first question provides the highest stressors for each generation and overall. The most frequent answer by all the participants was family and self. Within younger generations, Gen Z or millennials, the prevalent stress is derived from menial or daily tasks such as work or school. However, with older generations, it's derived from a more emotional place more frequently, such as grief being the third most common stressor overall. This difference in baseline stressors shows a generational gap in stressor priorities and could provide a reasonable explanation for the discrepancies in the type of literary media consumed. The second question focuses on the relevance of stressors to participants' consumption of literary media. The data showed a surprising lack of an overall trend, with the leading stressor being family by a fraction of a percentage. With all generations regarding work, self, and grief at an equal level, the individuality of each generation's stress is highlighted. With a similar trend to the first question, the older generations have an increased tendency to identify more emotionally focused stressors. After my data, my revised hypothesis is that younger generations have an increased tendency to cope unintentionally through virtual media, while older generations have an increased tendency to cope unintentionally through physical media. The revised hypothesis reveals areas of research that could be further explored, such as the importance of accessibility of technology throughout generations and how different stressors affect one's tendency to cope through literary media. So next time that you find yourself lost in a book or wanting to just escape in the face of stress, remember you are not alone in your procrastination.
How do the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
So initially I struggled a bit with deciding whether I wanted to go along a survey route or a research route. And when I decided my survey, I modeled it similar to a lot of the research and the research articles around my topic, but none were quite as in-depth as mine were, so it was hard to find a survey that would encompass all the complexities of my topic, but it ended up working out well by using not just multiple choice questions, but questions that have graphs or that have scales to help me balance it out.
How does your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So the good thing about my research topic is that when I was initially looking out for it, this was the first draft of my question that I had. I never had to edit the question because it fit perfectly in between the slides and the research. So my data fits perfectly along with my original hypothesis, except for one factor, and it fits directly into the slot between the amount of generational research and the amount of research around coping strategies. So it fits into the niche of literary reading.
How did you handle the uncertainty of the research process?
I struggled a little bit at first. At times it was pretty maddening to do this alone, but eventually I was able to realize that it's a relationship between myself and the research rather than myself and time. So I had to prioritize different parts of my research that I felt that were more important to myself, not only just to the facts of my data. And so when analyzing my data, I had a hard time figuring out how to do it because I had never done it before. And instead of doing it alone, I ended up asking for help. And that's what saved my research.
Very good.